Good evening. This is a breaking situation, and I don't use that phrase lightly. As we come on air right now, something irreversible has begun, not politically, institutionally. What we are witnessing is not a scandal unfolding, it is a containment failure. A system that was designed to control exposure has, in a single moment, lost control of the narrative it was trying to suppress. And once that happens, you don't rewind the tape. You don't put the documents back in the box. You don't reseal the vault. This is not about what was released today. It's about what could not be fully erased, because despite an extraordinary effort by the Department of Justice to obscure, redact, and neutralize the most politically explosive elements of the Epstein files, one piece of evidence made it through. Just one. And that was enough. Not because it's new, not because it's shocking in isolation, but because it confirms a pattern the system has spent nearly a year trying to deny, a pattern of delay. A pattern of selective transparency, and now unmistakably a pattern of protection. And here's the critical point. This didn't happen quietly. It happened in public, in documents that were supposed to close the book on this issue, documents that were promised as transparency, documents that were framed as compliance with the law. Instead, what they revealed was something else entirely. They revealed fear. Okay? So I've been covering politics for a long time now, and I thought I had seen everything. I thought after all the scandals and the lawsuits and the investigations and the impeachments, I thought nothing could shock me anymore. But what I'm about to tell you genuinely made my jaw drop when I first read about it, because we're not talking about financial fraud here. We're not talking about classified documents or hush money payments or any of the usual Trump controversies. We're talking about potential war crimes, actual war crimes, the kind of thing. And here's where this story becomes dangerous for the people trying to control it. Buried inside a release that is otherwise dominated by blacked-out pages, redacted names, and entire documents rendered unreadable, there is a passage that survived. Not summarized, not implied, written plainly. It describes a moment involving Jeffrey Epstein, a minor identified as Jane Doe, and a visit to Mar-a-Lago. The owner of that property is identified by name, Donald J. Trump. The description is not ambiguous. It is not speculative. It is not framed as rumor. It describes Epstein introducing a 14-year-old girl to Trump. It describes Epstein making a comment about her. It describes Trump's reaction. And it describes the discomfort of the minor who at the time did not fully understand what was happening, only that something was wrong. That passage exists in a document that was otherwise aggressively sanitized. And that raises a question the Justice Department has not answered. How does that get through? Because we're not talking about an oversight. We're talking about a process that involved months of review, multiple layers of redaction, and an explicit legal standard governing what could and could not be withheld. This wasn't a rushed dump. This wasn't a clerical error. This was a curated release. And yet, the single most incriminating connective moment involving Donald Trump remained. That is not random. This is the first sign of the central threat frame in this story. Two forces are closing in, and they are doing so from opposite directions. On one side, you have an executive branch that attempted to manage exposure by delaying, redacting, and reframing. On the other, you have a legal and legislative structure that does not allow reputational sensitivity as a justification for concealment. Those two forces are now colliding. Because the broader context matters here. The law governing this release is clear. Redactions are permitted for one reason only, to protect victims and minors. That's it. No carve-out for embarrassment, no exception for political fallout, no shield for powerful names. And yet page after page of these files is reduced to black boxes, not selectively, systematically. According to reporting acknowledged by Fox News itself, the Department of Justice applied the same redaction standard to politically exposed individuals and government officials as it did to victims. That is not interpretation. That is not spin. That is a statement of fact. And if that is true, then the department did exactly what the statute forbids, which is where this story stops being about documents and starts being about obstruction. Because the law doesn't just describe what must be released, it describes consequences for those who knowingly alter, conceal, or falsify records with the intent to impede an investigation or the proper administration of justice. The penalty is not symbolic, it is not procedural, it carries up to 20 years in prison. That statute exists for a reason. It exists for moments exactly like this, and now members of Congress are invoking it explicitly. Not rhetorically, not hypothetically, explicitly. Representative Thomas Massie has publicly laid out the contradiction. The statute says records cannot be withheld due to political sensitivity. The department says it applied redactions to politically exposed individuals. Those two statements cannot both be lawful, and Massie is not alone. His co-sponsor has gone further. She has stated on the record that the department's release does not comply with the Epstein Transparency Act, that a New York grand jury document ordered released by a federal judge was instead delivered completely blacked out, that there was no explanation provided for those redactions, none, and that the most critical documents were not released at all. The draft indictment, the prosecution memo, the files that would identify other wealthy and powerful individuals involved in or aware of the abuse. Those documents remain hidden, which brings us back to the second force closing in, because this is no longer just a transparency dispute. It is now an institutional standoff. Members of Congress are openly discussing impeachment of Justice Department officials, contempt proceedings, criminal referrals for obstruction of justice. Those are not idle threats. Those are constitutional mechanisms. And here's the escalation. Survivors are now involved directly, not abstractly, personally. Lawmakers are coordinating with them, preparing for public confrontation, preparing to bring them back to the Capitol, preparing to force this issue into the open. This is not a media cycle. This is not a Twitter storm. This is a process entering its enforcement phase. And Donald Trump is not peripheral to this, because in addition to the narrative evidence, there is corroboration. A photograph of Epstein with one of his victims holding a check for $22,500 signed by Trump. A figure that matches a previously revealed joke in Epstein's birthday book about selling a fully depreciated woman to Trump for that exact amount. That detail matters, not because of its crudeness, but because of its consistency, because it links documents, images, testimony, and past disclosures into a single factual web. This is how institutions determine credibility, not through one document, but through convergence, two forces closing in. And Trump now finds himself in the worst possible position. He is implicated in the substance of the files and implicated in the effort to suppress them. Cover up and content simultaneously. That is where this story begins, not ends, because once that dynamic exists, the system does not de-escalate, it accelerates, and that acceleration has already started. Now we move into the machinery. This is where emotion stops mattering and structure takes over, because once Congress starts speaking in statutory language instead of outrage, the system has already shifted phases. The central frame remains the same, two forces closing in. The first force is not media. It is not public opinion. It is the legislative oversight authority of Congress acting inside a statute it wrote, passed, and is now enforcing. That distinction matters more than anything else in this story. The Epstein Files Transparency Act was not symbolic legislation. It was not aspirational. It was drafted precisely to prevent this exact scenario. A scenario where politically sensitive names could be quietly shielded under the guise of victim protection. The language of the law is blunt on purpose. It explicitly forbids withholding, delaying, or redacting records due to embarrassment, reputational harm, or political sensitivity. It goes out of its way to remove discretion. Why? Because discretion is where cover-ups live, and that's why the DOJ's position is so dangerous for them institutionally, because they did not argue necessity, they did not argue safety, they argued process, and then Fox News confirmed that the same redaction standard used to protect victims was applied to politically exposed individuals and government officials. That admission is the fulcrum. Once that is acknowledged, intent becomes irrelevant. The statute does not require proof of motive, only action. And here is where escalation within Force 1 begins. Congress did not respond with press conferences. It responded with documentation, attachments, side-by-side comparisons, statute versus behavior. Thomas Massie's approach was surgical. He didn't accuse, he demonstrated. 3 documents placed next to each other. The law, the DOJ's explanation, The criminal statute governing obstruction. That structure is deliberate. It is how impeachment inquiries begin, not with allegations, but with incompatibility. You cannot comply with all three simultaneously. And once that contradiction is public, oversight stops being optional. The co-sponsor's statement escalates this further, because now there is an allegation of direct noncompliance with a federal judge's order. A grand jury document ordered released arrives entirely blacked out. No justification, no explanation, no compliance memo. That is not a gray area. That is defiance. And defiance triggers enforcement mechanisms automatically. Contempt of Congress, referral for prosecution, impeachment of executive officials. Those are not political weapons. They are constitutional tools. This is where people misunderstand the gravity of what's happening. They treat impeachment language as noise. It is not. It is the final warning stage before compulsion. And that compulsion is already being prepared because this isn't happening in isolation. Survivors are now integrated into the process. Their expectations were set publicly. They were told transparency was coming. They were told closure was imminent. Instead, they received black boxes. Why, that creates a secondary pressure point: moral authority. When survivors become active participants in an oversight dispute, delay stops being tolerable. The optics alone force action. But beyond optics, their testimony changes the stakes of enforcement. Now the question is no longer, did the DOJ comply? It becomes, who are they protecting? And that question leads directly back to Donald Trump, because his presence in the files is no longer speculative. It is documented. His name survives redaction where others do not. His financial link appears visually. His social proximity to Epstein is uncontested. This is where Force 1 stops being about transparency and starts being about obstruction. Because if the files are being withheld to prevent political damage, and if Trump is politically exposed, then the suppression itself becomes evidence of preferential treatment. That's the institutional trap, and Congress knows it. Which is why Massey and his co-sponsor are not dropping impeachment articles yet. They are waiting, letting the DOJ continue producing, letting each incomplete release compound the record. This is how inevitability is constructed, slowly, methodically, with receipts. Two forces closing in. The first is now fully engaged, and once Congress enters this phase, it does not disengage quietly, because the next step is subpoenas with deadlines, and deadlines are where systems collide. This is the point where the second force enters fully, and this is where escape routes start closing. The second force is not congressional oversight. It is legal exposure moving across jurisdictions. Domestic first, international second, simultaneous, not sequential. Two forces closing in. Domestically, the shift happens the moment obstruction becomes a live question instead of a hypothetical. Once members of Congress invoke the criminal obstruction statute by name, the matter leaves politics and enters prosecutorial logic. That statute is not ambiguous. It criminalizes knowingly concealing or altering records to impede an investigation or the proper administration of any matter within the jurisdiction of a U.S. agency. The threshold is intent inferred from conduct. Pattern matters more than confession, and the pattern here is no longer defensible as administrative caution. Months of delay, contradictory public statements, an abrupt reversal from no documents exist to hundreds of thousands exist, and finally a release that blacks out court-ordered material without explanation. That is cumulative behavior, and cumulative behavior is exactly how obstruction cases are built. Here's the escalation mechanism people miss. Congress does not prosecute obstruction. It refers. Once that referral exists, the decision leaves Capitol Hill and enters the Justice Department itself, or a special counsel structure if conflicts arise, and conflicts do arise here because the Department of Justice is not just the releasing authority, it is the subject of the allegation. That creates a structural problem, and structural problems trigger extraordinary remedies, special counsel, independent review, judicial oversight. At that point, control over timing evaporates. Now layer in the constitutional dimension. The Epstein Transparency Act was passed precisely to remove executive discretion in politically sensitive cases. Congress anticipated this moment. It closed the loopholes. It narrowed redaction authority. It constrained interpretation. Which means the executive branch cannot claim good faith disagreement. The statute's language was designed to preempt that argument. That puts this dispute on constitutional terrain. separation of powers, compliance with judicial orders, enforcement of legislative mandates. This is where the founders' design becomes relevant, not rhetorically, mechanically. The system was built to assume bad faith, to anticipate self-protection, to force transparency through competing authorities. And now those authorities are active at the same time, two forces closing in. But there's a third dimension forming in the background, and this is where the story stops being strictly domestic. The moment credible allegations involve systematic sexual exploitation of minors with international trafficking elements, jurisdictional questions change, especially when suppression or obstruction is alleged. This is where international human rights frameworks become relevant. Not immediately, but inevitably. Bodies like the International Criminal Court do not intervene lightly. They intervene when domestic systems appear unwilling or unable to fully investigate crimes of this nature, particularly when powerful individuals are implicated. No one is charging anything yet. That matters. But attention shifts the moment domestic suppression becomes part of the record. And here's why that matters for Trump specifically. He cannot claim distance. He cannot claim ignorance. He cannot claim that this is purely about Epstein. His name appears, his financial connection appears, his proximity appears, and now critically, his political influence appears to align with the suppression itself. This is where legal exposure multiplies instead of stacks. Obstruction compounds underlying allegations. Cover-ups elevate jurisdiction. Delay increases scrutiny. And now enforcement timelines begin to overlap. Congressional deadlines, judicial compliance schedules, potential prosecutorial review windows, not one after the other, together. This is the convergence moment beginning to form. And here's the structural reason Trump cannot escape it. He cannot force Congress to stop. He cannot force courts to accept redactions without explanation. He cannot control how obstruction statutes are interpreted once invoked. He cannot prevent survivors from testifying. He cannot prevent corroborating evidence from surfacing once review expands. Every move available to him worsens the situation. Silence looks like guilt. Intervention looks like interference. Delay looks like obstruction. This is the feedback loop. Each attempt to manage exposure increases institutional response. Each response triggers the next mechanism, and that loop is now visible. This is no longer about whether more documents will be released. It is about who controls the release and under what authority. Once control leaves the executive branch, the narrative changes completely, and that moment is approaching. Because the system does not tolerate indefinite noncompliance when minors and court orders are involved, it escalates, always. This is where the lines cross, and once they cross, there is no reset. Two forces closing in. Force one is Congress, no longer asking for transparency, but preparing enforcement. Force two is legal exposure, no longer theoretical, but structurally unavoidable. And now they are operating on the same timeline. This is the convergence moment, not sequential, not conditional, simultaneous. Congress is drafting impeachment articles while the Department of Justice is still producing documents it admits are incomplete. Courts have already issued release orders that were not meaningfully complied with. Survivors are preparing to return to the Capitol, and the statutory framework governing obstruction has been placed squarely on the table. That is convergence. And here's the critical reality that closes the exits. Donald Trump cannot wait this out. He cannot run the clock because Congress has no electoral deadline on oversight. He cannot litigate indefinitely because courts have already ruled. He cannot rely on redaction because the law forbids political sensitivity as justification. He cannot reframe this as partisan because Republicans are now on record disputing the DOJ's compliance. He cannot isolate this to Epstein because his own name, money, and proximity appear repeatedly and independently. He cannot is no longer rhetorical. It is structural. He cannot separate the cover-up from the content. He cannot claim ignorance while benefiting from suppression. He cannot argue transparency while evidence of concealment accumulates. He cannot credibly say this is over while the system is still activating. This is where the nightmare scenario becomes clear. Imagine this. A federal court orders a clean release with explanations for every redaction. At the same time, Congress issues subpoenas with fixed deadlines. Survivors testify publicly about what was promised versus what was delivered. And a criminal referral for obstruction is transmitted for review, all within the same week. Now, imagine documents released under compulsion, not discretion. Imagine names appearing not because the DOJ chose to release them, but because it was forced to. Imagine financial records and communications placed alongside prior testimony and photographic evidence. That is not chaos. That is process. And process is the enemy of anyone relying on delay. This is where the system versus individual frame becomes unavoidable. This is not about Democrats versus Republicans. This is not about Trump versus his critics. This is about whether the United States enforces its own laws when the subject is powerful. The hero here is not a person. It is the Constitution doing exactly what it was designed to do, checking power, forcing disclosure, punishing obstruction. That's why this moment feels different, because the machinery is moving, not rhetorically, mechanically. The clock is ticking, not in headlines, in deadlines, and every attempt to manage exposure now accelerates the outcome instead of delaying it. That's the final irony. Trump has managed to secure the worst possible position. He is both implicated in the underlying allegations and increasingly associated with the effort to suppress them. Those two tracks are converging, and once they meet fully, there is no narrative left to control. Which brings us to the only question that actually matters now. When the system finishes doing what it was built to do, will the full truth emerge through compliance or through compulsion? That answer is coming, and it's coming fast. Good evening.